The world is waking up, and you finding your way here today is no coincidence. The spirit world always has a way of guiding us where we most need to be at the absolute perfect time. I'm your host, Lindsay Morlock, and you're listening to the Guided Podcast, where we explore how the spirit world works on our behalf to guide us along our paths. This is where you'll learn how to live a life that is both conscious and connected, so you can supercharge your pathway to healing and open to life's magic and miracles. Come along this journey to see how guided you truly are. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Guided Podcast. Today, I am excited to introduce you to our next guest, Becc Nelson. So Becc is a spiritual, soulful, heart-centered healer, speaker, and author who has been serving as an expert in transformation and ascension since 1992. She is the best-selling author of Cut the Shit, Reframe Your Thinking, Regain Your Life. I love the title of that book. And with a master's degree in human development and as a licensed marriage and family therapist, Becc has the wisdom and knowledge to assist her clients in transformational healing of mind, body, and spirit. Becc's work as a psychic medium, ordained minister, and angel communicator provides a unique approach to healing that combines traditional approaches of therapy with intuitive guidance in her 90-day signature Beccology program. So Becc, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for being here.
Oh, I am so excited that you invited me. Thank you. I feel like I'm in good company, Lindsay.
You are, and I'm so excited to dive into so many different topics with you. But to kick us off, why don't you just start off by telling us about your own personal awakening into spirituality? You know, when and how did you start to awaken in your own life? How did you start to awaken to your own gifts?
You know, when I hear a lot of other people's stories, I feel like you look back on them and say, maybe I wasn't meant to do this, or I'm not meant to do this work, because you hear the people's stories and it's like, oh, I've been hearing spirits since I was 3. And, you know, Debbie's a good friend of mine. So I listened to her story and she talks about hearing spirits. And then I heard yours. And then I was like, okay, maybe it's not just me, right? Because I remember you saying in your story that it was kind of a little bit later. And that doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't happening. It just means that we weren't aware of it happening. It wasn't, like that for us. So it makes me feel like, okay, maybe my story is a little bit more normal than I thought, because I was really a bit older. Now, I was very aware of the fact that I was empathic earlier in my life. That I knew. I always knew that I was meant to help people, because people would be drawn to me and telling me their stories. And, back then I didn't know why, or I didn't know that everybody just didn't have that or do that. But I would be drawn to things like there was a girl who was kind of bullying me when I was in middle school. And I look back on it now, I wish I could find this girl. She was bullying me and sort of really targeting me. And it was making me very uncomfortable. And then one day she actually picked up a book and hit me in the face with a book. And I remember telling a teacher, because I just didn't really feel safe at home. I didn't feel safe at school. And when I told this teacher, the teacher actually brought her into the office. And then I saw her as I was walking past the office. She got called into the principal's office. And after that date, I think she kind of woke up and all of a sudden she wanted to be buddies. And I'm like, what is happening here? And then I found out very soon after that her mother had died of cancer. And then we were in middle school. So she was probably 12 or 13. So, this is a part of my awakening story as I look back, because I realized that people were drawn to me, but they didn't really know why they were drawn to me to talk to. So that's, I think, a part of the story that people don't think of as a traditional spiritual awakening, is that there are people that are drawn to you as a helper and they just don't get why. And sometimes they're not necessarily happy about it. But I always want to find that girl now and go back to her and be like, why were you, that was just crazy. And then I would be on vacations and people would randomly at the side of the pool in Disney World be telling me about those are my kids and my husband just left. And I'm like, why? I'm just here on vacation. Like, what's happening? So I guess that wouldn't be necessarily something people would think of as a traditional coming out party, right? For spirituality, but definitely for gifts and being a healer. So, but the other part of the story, which I do talk about in my book, is my Uncle Danny. And my Uncle Danny my dad is the oldest of 6. My Uncle Danny was number 2. And he was in Vietnam, had horrible PTSD, lots of issues, but very eccentric. And he and I were buddies. Like my dad and I were not close, but he and I were like, thick as thieves. And we were very drawn to each other. But he died when I was 17 from Agent Orange. He died in the VA. And shortly after that, I started having experiences where I just felt like he was around and I couldn't explain it. But then it would be random things like someone would say his name, or it didn't seem as odd in the beginning because we'd be around family. And I'm like, okay, well, this is our family. But it got bigger and bigger as I got older, and to the point where I'd be in counseling sessions and things would happen. And I felt like, just felt like his presence was there, almost like he was delivering people to me to see for counseling. And I couldn't explain why I thought that, but it would be like the person would be talking and then they'd be like, I was a Marine in Vietnam. And I'm like, interesting. And I just kind of blew it off. I was like, that must be a coincidence. Well, one day I was in a session and I was with a couple, and this is like maybe 20 years after he had died now. And the man of the couple I was seeing started to talk about his time in Vietnam when he was a Marine. And by this time I had gotten used to that. And he then started talking very specifically about somebody in his platoon. And as he talked about this person, it became very apparent that he was talking about my Uncle Danny. He described him to a T. Oh, the guy was hilarious. He was kind of shorter, and because he was shorter, they would send him into the foxholes. And I just sat. I mean, I my look on my face must have been, first of all, this is 20 years later. This is a couple session. Why are you talking about this in the middle of this couple session, right? So my face must have been just like gaping, right? And then he started saying, he was hysterical, but he had a lot of problems. And he's like, I don't think that he could read because his mother would send him letters all the time, and he would pull them out for us to read them to him because I don't think he could really read. And I was like, wow, I never heard that he couldn't read. So of course I had, and then like every time he'd come in, he'd start talking about this guy. And I just wasn't saying anything because this is not the time or the place. And then one time he said, oh my God, he used to have the head of a mallard duck, like a decoy duck in his pocket. So we started calling him Danny Duck. And I was like, that's exactly what they called him. I had heard those stories. So I was like, was his name? And I said his last name. And he was like, did you know that? And I was like, that was my uncle. And I just felt like, the goosebumps all over you. And he was like, yes, I'm here. I send you people to help that are my friends. It was amazing. Now, as if that was not enough, right? You want to hear more of this because it just gets crazier. As if that is not enough. Now we're going back a few years. Now, I had always heard that if you show the people or show spirit that you can understand them and hear them, that it would make it louder and worse. I already felt weird enough as it was. So I wasn't going to make that very obvious. So I just kind of didn't make a big deal out of it. I was like, that's really crazy that happened. What a coincidence. Ha, ha, ha. I didn't play into it. I didn't think about it. I didn't talk about it outside of my session, even though it was really amazing. But my husband and I this was in 2018. We went to Puerto Rico for our anniversary. And when we came back from Puerto Rico, I was going to go shopping, grocery shopping, because we didn't have any food in the house. My husband went into our detached garage to do some errands. He opens the door to the garage, and there's this huge chair sitting right in front of the door of the garage. Now, it's a chair that was in my office, and it was like huge, and it's one of those ones that he's going to fix, at some point. Now, it was in the corner of the garage, buried behind some crap, like you wouldn't have even been able to find it, and it was right in front of the door, the sliding door. So my husband took a picture of the chair, which in this actual picture, the one he sent me, is in my book, right? So he texts me a picture of the chair and says, did you move this here? And I said, nope. And I literally erased the picture because I knew exactly what was happening. I said, no, I erased it. And I went to BJ's. So I'm at BJ's and I'm grocery shopping. And this woman comes up to me and says, excuse me, I don't know if you believe in this or not, but there's a guy standing next to you. And she proceeds to describe him to a T. He's wearing a fishing cap and he's got a pipe in his mouth and he's young. And he's like, whoa, he is pissed. He is mad. She said, he keeps trying to get your attention and you are not paying attention to him and he's had it. Now, I just sat there like gaping, and her husband is standing behind her like, dum-de-dum. And I said, she does this all the time, hon. He's like, uh-huh. This little Hispanic lady, I've never seen her since. I've never seen her before. And the funny thing is, it's not the usual BJ's I go to. I went to a completely different one that I normally go to because now you look back, you're like, I was supposed to go to that one. Describes him to a T and says he's been doing things all along. You've ignored him. And she goes, oh, today he said he did something huge. Now, as she said that, she's getting the picture of exactly what happened. And she's like, oh, he said he moved something. Oh, he moved a chair, she goes. And I just was sitting there gaping like, I didn't say a word. Right. And I'm like, well, I guess I can't ignore this anymore. I don't even remember finishing my shopping. She had a bunch of stuff that she said that he's sending people, he's sending you messages. He wants you to know he's around. He's trying to guide you and you're blowing him off. And he said he's had it. And like, this is the last straw. And I was dumbfounded. I don't remember finishing my shopping. I don't remember checking out. I was just in a daze. And I didn't even call my husband on the way home. I just got home and I was like, you will never believe what just happened. Now, he also said some things he wanted me to tell my father at the time. And I was like, I can't tell this, he's going to think I'm nuts. That's exactly what I did not want. I didn't want anybody to think I was nuts. I didn't want to have to describe this to people. I didn't want to have to feel different. I just wanted to be a normal person. So that's why I didn't put it out there, but he made it very obvious that day that he wanted me to wake up and it was his job to put that out there. Now, this woman was like, he had to like really figure out how to move a lot of energy to actually physically pull that chair out of a corner under some crap and put it in front of you. And the other thing that I think he did that was brilliant that day is that he included somebody else. He included my husband because after that, like I said, I had erased that picture. So when after, months later, when I was like, okay, I'm just going to embrace this. I was like, oh, I really wish I had saved that picture. My husband's like, oh, I saved that picture. Let me send it to you, because now when he includes somebody else, now I'm not so nuts. Now I have somebody else backing me and be like, no, I saw the chair. And I know we had not been home in like a week and a half. Nobody else would have come into this garage.
So you had a witness.
Yes, we needed that because in that picture I put in my book because that was really important. Now, that was probably a long answer to your short question.
No, I love the stories because I think people see themselves in the stories, and these are the things that happen, right? I mean, I think all of us have some moment where we have these experiences on some level that are beyond the realm of our imagination. We start to question whether we are just making things up, whether we're going crazy, or whether they are just a series of coincidences. And the spirit world sometimes has to work very, very hard to get our attention and get us to pay attention. And it's interesting. I love that you brought up the fact that you were keeping in mind this myth or belief rather, that you had subscribed to, right? Of, oh, I heard that, if I pay attention to this or I acknowledge this, that spirit's going to get louder and louder and louder. And so there was fear there, right? That it was going to be scary to open this part of you up. And I think people initially have that reaction. Like, this can be really scary to not really understand what's going on and, questioning whether we are actually hearing these things or seeing these things, or people are just going to think we're nuts. And none of it's true, but that's how these beliefs, right, get passed along and we adopt them as we go, right?
Mm-hmm. That they were all going to say, look, come on over. She can hear us. Come.
Right.
And you know what? They kind of do, but
right.
I have since learned that I can make boundaries and say, not now, or don't wake me up, or, I decide when, like you would with any person.
Yeah, it's a two-way street, right? I love that you said that about you can create boundaries with spirit, and because it's a partnership. I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as well, where learning how to work with spirit, learning how to partner with them is a process just like any other relationship in your life, right? And I think oftentimes we just assume spirit is here to kind of push us around and tell us this is, what our life is supposed to look like, right? The idea of destiny and fate and things are fated and we don't get a say in the process is just untrue. We're really creating our life in partnership with them. But I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around how that partnership really works. But the only way to really, at least for me, the only way to really understand it has been by hearing, from different people and teachers, but also experiencing it for myself, for better or for worse.
And also to know that it's not necessarily the same for everybody, because I think you hear these stories and you think, if it doesn't go like that for me, it means I'm not doing it right, or I don't really have it, or whatever.
Yeah. And everybody gets their guidance so differently. So you mentioned, right, you're a medium, you're a psychic. So what are the different ways that you feel like spirit is guiding you and leading you in your life? I mean, you mentioned some of the ways they're coming through, departed loved ones, but in general, right, beyond getting guidance and communication from spirit in that way, like how are you intuitively led and guided in your own life?
I think all the clairs. I think the Claire that is the strongest hardest is the sentient. So I get that goosebumpy kind of feeling, the tap sometimes. And that's what led to me writing my book, is that I had always known, oh, I have a book inside me. I have a book inside me. And then I was in a session, and I had known that there were patterns that come up when I work with couples in particular, or somebody, and I'd hear the same patterns over and over again. And then one day I got the tap that said, when are you just going to write these down? Because at this time I was also trying to figure out, okay, what is my first book and what's that going to look like? And then you get that tap that's like, okay, now. And for me, it literally is, it does sometimes feel like a little tap, like a gentle tap, or that goosebump feeling, that there's like a wave of energy across my body that either will mean somebody's here, or look over here, or something. It could just be something as simple as, go back and look at that number again, or something like that. But it's usually in a form of a energetic wave. But also I've got a lot of angel numbers. I very rarely actually hear it, and voices or phrases, but sometimes I will. I did hear a phrase from my dad. My dad has since departed, and but I'm keeping him at arm's length for right now, so he just kind of comes through in little pieces. But then I also, I think the hardest one is where the thought pops into your head, the claircognizance, because you don't really know if that's, did I put that thought in there, or is that somebody else's? That's, I think, the hardest one. But I always, when I'm with clients, I do get this thing pops in your head and just say this. And now I can tell when it's claircognizance, when somebody says, how did you know that? And then in my head, I'm like, oh, yeah, how did I know that? Right? So
totally. That's one of the reasons I love using a pendulum too, because I can usually use the pendulum to check, like, was that you, spirit, or was that my ego jumping in and trying to discern the difference between soul speak and ego speak? Can be hard sometimes, because sometimes the ego upgrades to imitate spirit.
Oh yeah, we'll have to get into that when we talk about self-sabotage, right?
Yeah. Well, since you brought up your book, let's dive into that a little bit, because your book really, I mean, cut the shit, right? Like so what is the premise of this book? And I want to really dive into some of the concepts in it, because I think it's really powerful.
When I was in graduate school, something really struck with me, that in one of the classes, they said, anybody who comes to you for help probably you have to dig into what their intended solutions were first, because sometimes when people come to you, it's because their intended solutions actually made their problem worse. And there's obviously very many ways that people can do that to make their problem worse. But the one that I focus on in the book is that I'm going to put my thoughts or my beliefs onto other people and tell them how to change to make me happy, right? So deflecting or that kind of thing. So if everybody in my life would just do what I want them to do, then my life would be great. So they do that, and then if you kind of figure that out, and then I've figured out when I was doing my counseling sessions, that there was probably about 14 ways that people do that, put their intentions or put their the impetus to change on other people. And there were 14 ways that people do that. So the problem with that is that when you put your decision on other people, or you tell them how they're going to change, first of all, that's not going to work. So that causes bigger problems, because other people are going to start to get resentful, first of all, where you're all alone, but then and then they get pissed off at you. So you ruin your relationships. But the other thing is that you give your power to make you happy to other people. So ultimately they sabotage themselves by saying, I'm going to give the other people the power to make me happy. And that just doesn't work.
Yeah. It's interesting, because I knew your book was about self-sabotage, and I am a big offender of self-sabotage. And so, it was interesting because someone pointed out this to me recently about, where and how I self-sabotage. But, when I Googled self-sabotage, because I feel like we hear this word thrown around all the time. Oh, you self-sabotage, you self-sabotage. But when I Googled it and actually looked at a simple definition of self-sabotage and the different ways that this plays out, we don't necessarily have the awareness of how we sabotage ourselves, or even why we're sabotaging ourselves. So what are some of the themes or things that you see among your clients? And maybe you could highlight just a few of the most common patterns around self-sabotage that you're seeing. Why do people do it?
Well, the main reason that I think that people do it is this word homeostasis. So homeostasis is a word that people use in biology and that kind of thing. It's you hear that word a lot, and it's a tendency for a system to want to maintain itself. So let's broaden the word system to your family system. A system could be anything, your coworkers, your siblings, anything, people that you live with. And when you your ego tells you this is your story, this is the role that you play in this system. So I think of it as like when I watch my favorite show, one of my favorite shows is 2.5 Men, right? And my husband hates the character of Alan because he's so cheap and, sucks off of other people and whatever. And I want to say to my husband, he's just a character, right? And we kind of adhere to that. Like we tell ourselves we're going to play a character, and then we act as if we are stuck to this role our whole lives. And that could be people who were constant givers and do everything that everybody says, and we feel like our role is to give of ourselves and not have good self-care or not have good boundaries. Or that's just an example. So whatever role it is that you play in whatever all of the systems that you're in, you tell yourself in the back of your head, I can't change this role, because if I change this role, then it will change everybody else's role, right? So let me give you an example of that, because that sounds weird, right? So if I tell you, let's say I am somebody who's obese, okay? So I am the person who has a hard time losing weight, and nobody ever will touch me because I'm too heavy, and I'm really not going to ever be happy in my love life because I'm too heavy, etc. Now, I play a role in other people's lives. Some people feel badly for me. Some people in their head are like, well, at least I'm not as heavy as her, so I'm doing okay, which sounds crazy, but you ultimately know that if you start to now suddenly lose weight, what's going to happen? What's everybody going to think? Now you may not be that person. You're not going to play that role for everybody. So with let's say your siblings, if you're the heavy one, then they always get to look at you and say, oh, you're the one who can't control yourself or whatever. You're playing that role so that they can play their role. And way in the back of your head, subconsciously, you're like, if I lose weight, then they won't be able to play their role. And then who are they going to blame all their problems on? Or who are they going to make fun of? They'll have to look at themselves. I don't want them to look at themselves. So I just stay heavy. I sabotage my efforts to lose weight. Maybe I lose some weight, but ultimately I'm afraid to change the homeostasis. Does that make any sense?
It makes sense. I mean, I think too, a lot of that self-talk or whatnot is also happening on a subconscious level, right? Like you're conscious of the roles that you play or how people you interact with perceive you. But I don't think most people are that conscious or aware of all of those beliefs, right? Which is probably why that pattern of homeostasis and the ego wanting to keep us safe, meaning keep us stuck, takes such a stronghold, right? I mean, I know in my own life, as I've made changes around spirituality, around who I'm becoming, changes in jobs, I mean, it made people uncomfortable. And there were relationships that I had to let go of because it wasn't going to be serving where I was going for whatever reason, or dynamics and friendships changed because people wanted to either I always think of the crabs in the bucket, right? Like you're trying to get out of the bucket, and people who don't want those patterns within you changing because they were somehow benefiting from how you were, they're trying to pull you back down into the bucket. And when we're trying to up level or ascend or evolve, we can't stay the same. We have to change our behaviors, and we have to get out of the proverbial bucket, so to speak. And I think it can be hard or feel scary sometimes because we don't know what's on the outside of the bucket, even if it's going to be better, right?
Exactly. And you make another good point, Lindsay, which is it's not always coming from within us that I don't want to change because I don't know what's going to happen with the other people, or I don't want that. Is that the other people put pressure on you to go back to where you were, even though they don't realize that they're doing it necessarily. Like say, okay, let's go back to the food thing. The other people around you might bring home cake or something. And, they're like, oh, well, it was, I know you like this cake, so I bought it. And they're, putting it out there like, I'm just thinking of you. I know you like this cake, but really, is this a sabotage effort? Because if I'm trying to lose weight and you're bringing home cake, then clearly you're sabotaging me. Now, in my head, I'm like, okay, I'm already struggling with not eating this cake, but clearly this person is uncomfortable and not going to support me in this effort.
Right. I can remember, I mean, because so much of this example that you're using was my own journey. I remember having to be, at work where every single birthday was celebrated with cake and cookies. And I had to make the choice repeatedly not to eat any of those things because they were like a gateway drug. And once I started with one, it was over. So I was just better off if I didn't start. And it's funny because people used to say, oh, I need to channel disciplined Lindsay, this is this particular Lindsay at a time in my life where I was incredibly disciplined. And yet you had the other side of the coin where people were judging, oh, this is no way to live. This is too disciplined. You have no moderation, which also was true. But there was something about knowing who I was and what I needed to support myself in that particular time to support the goal and the desire that I was trying to achieve. And now at a place in my life where I need to be disciplined in other areas, I find myself kind of going back to that moment to draw on the discipline that I was able to have at that time and apply that to the discipline that I now need in a different area of my life moving forward. And it's interesting though, because where I wasn't self-sabotaging at that particular time, I can see how much easier it is at this particular time in my life to sabotage around some new goals that I'm trying to achieve. And so it is such an evolution, and some of these old self-sabotage patterns, they just feel so deeply rooted. Are you finding that in your work?
I am. And I feel like in particular, people who want to serve, who feel a need to serve others or feel a pull to serve others in making those boundaries, because typically when we want to serve other people, the universe brings people around you that want to be served. And when you start to make better boundaries and that you're not serving on the level that you were, the other people in your life are going to make you feel about that. And that's what I find a lot too, is that when in this, their desire to not go so far on the scale of serving that they're not having any self-care or any self-boundaries, that's the issue, is that's the block. Well, it's almost like they can only see two poles. Either I serve everybody or I'm an asshole. Do you know what I mean? Like I have to, there's nowhere in between. So they tell themselves, I can't stop doing this because that's not who I am. I still want to, on some level, help people, and I'm not a jerk. And then I'm saying, well, what about, can you find a way? Can we get you somewhere in the middle so that you can still serve, but not give up all of who you are? And the other people in your life are not going to make you, they're not going to be like, oh, you're making better boundaries. Good for you. Most people are going to make you feel guilty for that.
Yeah, it sounds like some of the themes that you're weaving in here are rooted in challenges around codependence, right? Where we're either giving to get love, or, we're serving everybody because we attach our sense of self-worth to the abandoning ourselves or giving to everybody else. And the minute that we start taking care of ourselves, it's like that same dopamine hit isn't there that you get from serving others. And we really need to change that pattern and that narrative, because the truth of the matter is that we really cannot be of service to other people if we're not being of service to ourselves, right? I mean, I know in the hand analysis world, when we talk about, especially people who are in the school of service, which is where I am, that journey is as much about learning how to be of service to the self as it is about being of service to others. But the student pathway to learning that lesson is basically self-abandon until you're so depleted that you have no choice but to really evaluate how you're showing up for yourself and how you're caring for yourself. I mean, I know for me, there's times where I've stopped all client work because I need to get back to myself, because it doesn't feel responsible to be serving others if I'm not being of service to myself or taking care of myself. But having the awareness of doing that, or when we need to do that, sometimes we don't always see it. We push through, we ignore our own needs, especially as women. I think there's something in society that trains us to abandon ourselves as a gender role or stereotype, right?
Yeah. And go back to the notion of self-sabotage, go back to that because that word homeostasis is going to come into play again. When you're in that journey of how do I take better care of myself, the system wants you to go back to your role of being this person who just gives and gives in this particular example, and because they just want to take. And when you don't do that, the system tries to pull you back into that role, and you're trying to pull out of it, and you're not realizing that that's what's happening, that there's going to be that pull that's completely natural, and that some people are going to fall away. It's a difficult lesson to learn. Some of the ways that people do that, because I'll go back to the question that you asked, somehow I got away from that. Some of the ways that people do that is one of them is perfection. That's one of the self-sabotages, which is I'm going to try to make everything look as perfect as possible, and I'm not going to execute anything until it's completely perfect. So that's a self-sabotage, because we know that you can never be completely perfect, but you tell yourself it's kind of irresponsible to not be perfect, or what are people going to think if it's not completely perfect? So then they just never put anything out because they're just waiting for that moment.
I so am guilty of that one.
That's one of them. Another one is kind of overscheduling yourself. You just say yes to everybody, and go back to that other piece, which means you're kind of saying no to yourself, so that you're so busy that you become overwhelmed. And then some people say that when they become overwhelmed, they almost like shut down because they're too overwhelmed with everything that they have to do and not putting in time for themselves. So overscheduling or overpromising is another one.
Yeah. And that one feels really closely linked to the overwhelm. I'm curious how many people, because I'm thinking of examples in my own life where I get to the point, I may not be overscheduled, but I can even emotionally, right, get to the point of overwhelm where that will just shut everything down. So it's interesting the different ways that overwhelm will show up.
Right. And if you say yes to too many people, then you're always saying no to yourself ultimately.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about too, all the different ways that we all say no to ourselves, right? I mean, overscheduling isn't, or overpromising and trying to be available to all the people for all the things is an easy way to see that. But I'm also curious how many other ways that we do that, even if we're not overscheduling. I mean, high achievers, and I'm sure that's probably who you're working with the perfectionists and the overachievers and the overschedulers. There's definitely a theme I can see emerging, right, with people in that particular group. And I'm also curious how, if we look at it as a more generalization, these different emotions drive that self-sabotaging behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that the hardest one is probably the perfectionism. I think that's probably the hardest one to, or the hardest group to work with, because working hard or wanting things to look perfect almost sounds like it's prudent, or it almost sounds like, you know what I mean? Like people would look at that and say, well, what's wrong with that? So overscheduling can be like, oh, well, you're doing too much. But what's wrong with wanting things to look as great as good as they are? Like, isn't that being responsible? So it's almost hard to get people to understand how that could be a sabotage.
I also think of the perfectionism, the underlying fears around it, like fear of making a mistake, right? Like, so it's perfectionism becomes a safety net, because if we know that perfectionism or being perfect is completely unattainable and totally relative to begin with, but if it's completely unattainable, then it also prevents us from taking any kind of risks, because I think somewhere deep down, people also know that there's no such thing as perfection. And so it either becomes a great excuse or great way to beat ourselves up to keep us feeling less than, or it keeps us from taking any kind of risks at all, because if we can't be perfect, then we're not even going to take action on it, right?
Yes. That almost leads into another one, which is procrastination. So procrastination is when you keep telling yourself, like, I'll do it later. And that's a self-sabotage, because then you're stressing yourself out more. Now go back to what I said before, that your intended solution becomes the problem. You're telling yourself, I'm going to put it off till later when I'm less stressed or less tired or whatever. But what happens is now you have to do very stressful things in a short period of time, which obviously is going to make you more stressed.
Yeah. And I think you're bringing up a good point here too, which is, we can mentalize the concept of self-sabotage and understand our patterns and our behavior. And also what it's speaking to is that that there's an underlying emotion to all of these things, right? Whether we're talking about fear with the perfectionism, whether we're talking about overwhelm, and now in talking about procrastination, right? Like the emotion of worry is designed to help us prepare for something. And if we block feeling worried, we tend to procrastinate. And so I think this is where, having learned what emotions mean, that they're intuitive messages from our soul, and that every single emotion is sending us some sort of message to help us understand what we need to know about ourselves, right? But so many of us have been trained to go to our minds to think our feelings, not actually feel them. And so then we end up, like you're saying, totally procrastinating because we're not feeling the worry that we might feel. But really, if we're worried about taking a test, it's because that energy is helping us to prepare to study to take the exam. And so if we're so worried about it and we block that worry, we procrastinate. And then it becomes self-sabotaging because, like you're saying, we've procrastinated. Now we're not as prepared as we could be to take this test. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think that's the other piece that has to be acknowledged in all of this, is that, we have to start paying attention. And I say this message to myself because no matter how much I have studied emotion or been taught the intuitive messages of every emotion, if we don't bring conscious awareness to what we're feeling, that we're even having a feeling, and for me, I had to relearn all of those things. And I even fall back into patterns of going unconscious to it. And so it does take a lot of conscious awareness to bring that attention to these patterns with the intention of changing them, right?
Two main things I think with procrastination. One is that you hear over and over again that people will tell you this complete lie, that that's when they do their best work, when I save it to the last minute, which is obviously a load of crap, because
I used to say that, like, I need the pressure. I need the pressure to perform. Yeah.
But subconsciously, it's almost like you're afraid that completing a job successfully will only be rewarded with more hard work and the expectations that come with that success. So people will expect more from you from what you've accomplished. So you're kind of pulling back on being successful, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And that's the self-sabotage, right? It's like a sneaky way of infiltrating so that it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes. People will expect more of me if I actually get things done. And I don't want to do that. So I get less done, but they don't realize that that's what they're really doing.
I can remember jobs. I think that's important though, because I can remember jobs I had where my coworkers and I would talk about how good work was rewarded with more work. Whereas people who maybe weren't producing in similar ways were never asked to do more. And I think it became, for colleagues that I worked with, right, it became this, you didn't want to perform. You, like you're saying, right? You didn't, or you wanted to hide, or you wanted to, because you didn't want to have to be working harder because you were producing. I mean, it's so backwards when we think about it, and just what is positively affirmed in our society versus what is not. But what you're saying reminds me of that.
Exactly. And you know what? Unfortunately, a lot of times that is true. It does happen like that sometimes.
And I get it. People want work done at a certain quality and caliber. And so it's understandable why certain people were being requested more work. But I don't think we're always looking at the accountability factor either when it came to other people's behavior. And so while that is not the intention or focus of this conversation, it is interesting to think about where we hold ourselves accountable. And so when it comes to self-sabotage, how are you helping your clients hold themselves accountable for changing these self-sabotaging behaviors? I mean, are there tips or tricks that help people to stay conscious and aware to these patterns of self-sabotage? And how do you help them to overcome them?
The most important thing is to figure out how it's serving them. What is it? What are the things that you're telling yourself, or that your ego is telling yourself, how are you benefiting from sabotaging yourself? Is it that you're afraid to succeed? Is it, what exactly are the reasons? Or are you afraid that you're going to change that homeostasis, as we talked about, like what'll happen if I change my particular role? And so we really need to hone in on what it is that they're telling themselves is the reason that they need, because somehow that benefit is greater than the success that might be on the other side of it, or those fears. And fear is always ego-based. And then we talk about, okay, so what are those things true? And, where is it that you want to be? And how are the lies that you're telling yourself, are they helping you get where you want to be, or are they keeping you, holding you back? And who else might you disappoint, or who else might you impact in the process? Because a lot of times it has to do with the other people in your life and your roles, your expectations, this homeostasis.
So I hear a lot from you about the roles of other people, right? But what are some of the other challenges or barriers that you see to people being able to change or challenge the self-sabotaging behaviors?
In particular, like this, the book that I wrote focuses on, it can't possibly be me. It must be something that other people are doing, and they're not honing in on the stuff that they can fix themselves. So it's got to be everybody else. So, and that's what my book is about. How are you actually getting in your own way by telling other people that they need to change? And really what they need to do is look at themselves and understand that change and your reflection in the world is going to come from within you. That's kind of the Ho'oponopono theory.
Yeah. My teacher calls this the shame, blame, victim game, right? Where we're pointing the finger externally to everybody around us. You did this, you did this, you did this, or things as a reason to blame, or like you said, not take responsibility for our piece of the equation, but it's always about us. That's the thing that I think I've learned most about the spiritual journey, is that like every time we're pointing the finger somewhere else, it always is about us. And so we have to be willing to turn that finger around and point it back at ourselves and look at how we're creating these things and the dynamics that show up. And that's, I think, some of the power of not some of the power, that is the power of the work, because we can't, like you're saying, we can't control other people, but we do have control over our own behavior. We have control over how we show up and the responsibility we take for ourselves and for our own healing. And if we do that, the people that we surround ourselves with change too, right? So I feel like people are either going to rise to the occasion and rise to the level that we're ascending to, or like we were talking about, they kind of vibrate out of your experience altogether, which can be hard to think about, but it's ultimately a good thing, because then you solidify or shore up the type of people that you're surrounding yourself with on a consistent basis that are more like vibe ultimately in the end.
You know, another thing that I think comes up is this entitlement. Like, Becc, you don't get it. This is what's happened to me in my life. And so I've been screwed, and now it's my time. And now I have the right to tell other people what they need to do differently because I've been wronged. So they're entitled to blame other people. They're entitled to expect other people to change around them because of what they've been through.
Interesting. And you qualify that as entitlement.
I call it that in my book because that's kind of the word that they would use. I'm entitled, or they always, I can tell when they're going to use, when they're using that, because they'll start with, you don't understand. Or, they'll say, I'll have a couple, and then the husband or the wife will say, he, yelled at me and called me this, this, and this. And instead of taking responsibility for it and saying, yeah, I did say those things, they will say, well, did you ask him what he said first?
Yeah.
As if, I don't have to take responsibility for what I'm saying because I was hurt first. So, and therefore I have the right to do this.
It's so interesting. We're really attached to our stories. And I know I can see myself in everything that you're saying in some way, shape, or form. Because I think if we're all really honest with ourselves about, who we are and how we show up, we all do these things on some level, right? They might look a little different. They all taste a little bit of a different flavor. But yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense that when people are really attached to their pain and attached to their stories, that it's so much easier to just pass the buck and not have to look within.
I think a lot of times that we are taught that power comes from anger. And so that's where the entitlement is. I'm going to use my anger to grow, instead of saying I'm going to use this as an opportunity to change and become more empowered. They see anger as power.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And again, I feel like I keep coming back to, with everything that you're saying, it also is like a lack of understanding of emotion and what our emotion is telling us, right? Because when someone's angry, a boundary violation has occurred. It's just a question of, did the boundary violation happen between you and someone else, or did you violate your own boundaries? And people are I think quick to blame other people when they're angry, but it's like, oh, well, you're really angry angry at yourself, but people don't always want to look within and acknowledge where they're not showing up for themselves. We're kind of coming full circle here with that conversation, right? Coming back to like, being of service to the self and really bringing conscious awareness and attention to our own emotions and what they're trying to tell us as far as our own evolution is concerned.
Well, the anger a lot is about, if my issue is all my life I felt like nobody's ever put me first or chosen me, or I've been, pushed aside or abused or whatever the thing is, how do I decide to get that back in my life? Is that I demand it from other people. And that becomes the problem, is now that I am now aggressive instead of assertive, which pushes other people away, which then just affirms that nobody's ever there for me and I can't count on anybody else.
Yeah. And where the boundary violation happens is because they abandon themselves in relation to other people, right?
But it only serves to support what they have already, the story that they've already told themselves.
Totally. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'm in total agreement with that. Yeah. And so the cycle just keeps perpetuating itself.
Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of ways or a lot of reasons that people self-sabotage, and a lot of people are probably employing more than one. So it's very important to kind of pull those all out and saying, how is this really serving you? And is that really true? Whatever you're telling yourself.
Yeah. We have to question ourselves constantly and question our self-talk and our beliefs, because we say a lot of things that literally make no sense, but we're not always kind to ourselves, for sure. Mm-hmm. Well, this is awesome, Becc. I hope people will dive more into your book and get more information about the other like 11 or 12 ways that we didn't cover of self-sabotage. But, as we start to wrap up here, what advice would you offer people starting out on their own spiritual journey?
Ooh, always have a mentor. I think that we tell ourselves that this is something that we need to figure out ourselves, right? But I feel like there's always somebody who's at least one step ahead of you and has been through that, pretty much that same journey. And so kind of look around, listen, go to some lectures, watch videos on YouTube, and find somebody else that seems like they've had a very similar journey to you, because that means that person's already walked in your shoes and they're not going to judge you because they've been there. And if they're on the other side of it, then they've learned how to do it successfully, and they probably can help you do the same.
Yeah. And one fun question I like to wrap up with is, how do you see magic and miracles playing out in your own life?
Oh my gosh. Once you learn that whatever you kind of ask and it'll happen, that is very true. And I think you need to always watch how you put things out into the universe, right? Because whatever you say is. And so I love to do things like, I just leave things up to spirit and say, I want to have these pieces of furniture gone. So just bring somebody to me who thinks that this is a good deal and wants this furniture, because other people are like, oh God, nobody wants, bookcases anymore or whatever. And I just say, I have to push that aside and say, spirit, just bring the right person to me. And somehow it just always happens. And I love that.
Yeah. I hear so many themes in what you're saying, Becc, of like asking for help, right? Whether it's getting a mentor, whether it's asking spirit for help, questioning your beliefs, questioning your challenges. But I hear this like a theme of almost non-attachment, right? Like asking for help and then like letting go of how all of these different things are going to happen, but at the, not the expense, that's probably not the right way to put it, but you're almost like challenging any limited thinking that you might have that would prevent that manifestation from fully showing up.
Exactly. And when you just let it happen, like, I don't know how it's going to happen, but I know that you will make it happen, and that you have miracles happen, then honestly, miracles do happen. And I'm just like, see, at first you're amazed, and then you're like, yep, that's just the way it is when you believe it and you live it.
Well, and your story about your uncle was super magical too, honestly.
I know. I think, secretly, I was probably putting out there, I would see other people that were mediums and I would say, gosh, I really wish I could do that. And I'm sure that he was the one that was sent to be like, well, you can. And I couldn't believe it unless it was something I could really relate to.
Yeah. And then you got it.
I did.
I think that's important, that spirit always works with us and communicates with us in ways that we're going to understand, right? So whether it's this person in BJ's who needed to come through to you to validate and acknowledge the presence of your uncle, spirit can go to great lengths to get our attention. And sometimes that comes through the form of communicating through other people. Sometimes that comes in the form of feelings or physical pain, even in our body. Sometimes it comes in the form of these crazy synchronicities that cannot be denied. And so we just have to be open and aware that it's possible or it's happening, right? In order to connect with it.
I think the angel numbers they're relentless.
Talk to people about angel numbers, because I don't know that everybody would know what they are.
So angel numbers are usually a number that's repeated at least 3 times. So 111, 222. And I it's funny because I have a friend who we are always looking, every time we look at our phone, it'll be 222 or 323. And we take a selfie of it or a snapshot of it and send it to the other person like, they're fully aware today. They're fully active. So every angel number has a different meaning. But it just lets you know that they're around and that they're present in your life. And there's lots of places where you can look up what angel numbers mean, but you might see it on the time, you might see it on a license plate. It just that you just happen to look in a direction and like you get that little tap that just says look up, and then you'll see that repeated number on the license plate in front of you or a billboard or something like that.
Yeah. And I always tell people and Google it, right? Like angel number 111, angel number 222. And I think we all have our own variations of what angel numbers mean to us. Like I know 333, what that means for me based on all of the years, right? And so spirit's going to use that interpretation of 333 with me, but 333 might mean something a little bit different for somebody else. And so that's where you create your own spiritual dictionary with spirit that they're going to use and create this frame of reference for what different signs and symbols mean, whether it's numbers, whether it's animals, whether it's, I have a certain meaning when I see a feather, it means I'm on the right path, right? But a feather for someone else might mean trust. So this is where it's really a two-way street with spirit, and you get to help determine what your own reference points are. And that helps spirit to communicate with you as well.
Mm-hmm. And I really love that you can say that. Like if I'm supposed to, or if it's a yes, or if you're saying you're around, show me 222 or something like that. And you can individualize it to you. That they're amazing. That all those things that you learn, those are miracles to me.
Exactly. Well, Becc, how can our listeners support you?
You can go onto my website, which is my name, Becc, BECCNelson.com. You can take your self-sabotage specialty quiz on my website, and you can get your results. You can also buy my book, Cut the Shit, which is available on Amazon or wherever you get books, in both a Kindle version and a hardcover version. And I'm about to put out a companion journal called The Reveal, which is also offers you extra space to be able to do some of the exercises and work through the places in the book, which might help you to figure out what your self-sabotage specialty is and how it serves you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here again. And I know people will have fun diving into all of these different quizzes and things that they can find at your website.
Thank you for having me. That was super fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the Guided Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, I would be so grateful if you would share it with a friend or even leave me a review so we can ensure that it makes its way into the ears of listeners who need to hear these messages most. Until next time, may you remember how guided you truly are.